Hello, I'm Luke Hunt, and this is a podcast for The Diplomat. With me today is Peter Starr, who's been the chief editor on a new book about Heng Samrin, who is one of the classic, even iconic characters of Cambodian politics, who led the invasion of Vietnam over into Cambodia that ousted the Khmer Rouge eventually in 1979 from Phnom Penh. Peter, welcome to the podcast, and congratulations on the book, The People's Struggle, Cambodia Reborn. Tell us a little bit how this book came into being. I understand there was a book out on Heng Samrin a few years ago, and this has been circulating in Khmer, but this is the first English language edition, and it's quite an historical document.
Yeah, the original memoirs of Heng Samrin were published in Khmer in 2013. That had limited distribution to an international audience, obviously. It was mainly targeted at a Khmer audience, a Cambodian audience. That was a second edition of that book came out in Khmer in 2016. That was basically more or less the same as the first edition, with a few extra photographs that were not in the first edition.
Tell me about Heng Samrin the man. He's former Khmer Rouge. He fought with them, and then he realised, like many within the eastern zone of the Khmer Rouge, who were based along the Vietnamese border, he realised what the Khmer Rouge were doing to their own country, and in particular to their own people. He saw that, he fled, he went to Vietnam, and he came back.
Well, what's very interesting about this book, which, his memoirs, is that the first 2/3 of it really is before the liberation of Phnom Penh in 1979. He goes into quite a lot of detail about his early childhood, about studying with a monk for 3 years and then entering a Buddhist monastery for 5 years, and joining the party and gradually making early contacts with the Vietnamese in the early 60s, and gradually becoming a member of the Khmer People's Revolutionary Army, and basically moving up various military ranks until he eventually commanded his own division.
Right, and that was, 5,000 to 8,000 men?
Something we've done with the English version of this book, there's quite a lot of changes to the Khmer version. One thing we've included is the size, or the approximate size, of Cambodian and Vietnamese military units, because they weren't exactly the same. From my understanding, the Cambodians followed more of a French system, whereas the Vietnamese followed more of a Soviet system. So, in Cambodia, a division was anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people.
It must have been one hell of a fight to come here and oust the Khmer Rouge.
The details of what happened in December 1978 are already well documented. As you know, we did this in a coffee table book, an illustrated history, which we did back in 2011. That was when Heng Samrin was chairing the ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly. We did a nice little coffee table book with lots of old Soviet photos we got from that period. What's interesting about this book is the military history that goes before that. It goes into extraordinary detail, particularly geographic detail, about the fight against Lon Nol, who overthrew Prince Sihanouk as head of state in 1970. Then it goes into quite a lot of detail about, I suppose it was a false dawn, if you will, in 1975 when the Khmer Rouge came to power. What's very, very interesting is Heng Samrin recounts a lot of the problems he had with Ta Mok, the so-called butcher.
Who was a military chief.
Exactly, and he was responsible for the southwestern zone. Heng Samrin was coming from the eastern zone under the command of Sopum. There was quite a lot of early confrontations before 1975 that Heng Samrin's forces had with Ta Mok's forces. And Heng Samrin actually recounts how he lost many of his men who simply disappeared when they entered the southwestern zone, and when they made inquiries about what happened to them, they didn't really find out. They basically just disappeared.
Yeah, I remember one small tale from the book how his soldiers were, I guess, browbeat, sick, and needed medicine, and
Exactly.
were being denied real medicine, and so he sent off dispatched two units, two separate occasions.
Exactly.
First unit goes out, they don't come back.
They were looking for traditional medicine, various plants, medicinal plants up in Phnom Chiso, which is in Takao province, and that was in the heart of the southwestern zone. And exactly that, they went off, and he lost 2 groups of men, never heard of again.
Right, and this was earlier on in the piece, and then
this was before 1975.
Right, and then later on, it was becoming obvious that the purges within the Khmer Rouge, which I might add were subject to the genocide tribunal, which recently secured a convictions against Nun Chia and Khieu Sampan. But it was that purge that really split the Khmer Rouge and enabled this, I was going to say Vietnamese faction, but that's not quite the right term, but enabled a lot of these soldiers, cadre, to defect to Vietnam, and where they formed their own militia and came back with a vengeance.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that the internal struggles internal conflicts within the Khmer Rouge were sort of pretty evident from day one. After they liberated Phnom Penh in April 1975, Heng Samrin recounts at one stage seeing these young men sort of wearing black pajamas. Now, they were from the northeast, up in the various ethnic minority zones, and a lot of them didn't speak Khmer. From all the accounts we have, is that the soldiers in the eastern zone were wearing regular military uniforms, khakis or whatever. So, from day one, Heng Samrin's forces were having problems with, again, Tam Mok's forces from the southwestern zone. At one point, Tam Mok's forces blocked off Monivong Boulevard and said, well, no one was allowed to step over to the western side of Monivong Boulevard.
Which of course, is the main street through the capital, Phnom Penh.
And what happened, and one of Heng Samrin's senior officers was actually imprisoned by Tam Mok's forces. This is immediately after liberation in 1975. We've slightly, in doing this and working with the editor in Singapore, Tim Auger, we did a slightly different cut of the chapters. The text is all the same, but we've actually created more chapters, and this particular chapter we've entitled False Dawn, for fairly obvious reasons. The other interesting thing is that, Heng Samrin's forces didn't stay very long in Phnom Penh after 1975, April 75. It was only, I can't remember, a month or two, and they were ordered back to Pre Veng province in the eastern zone. And it was quite interesting when he recounts, crossing the bridge at the end of Monivong Boulevard, crossing the Basak River. They were frisked by the Khmer Rouge soldiers, and basically everything was taken. They were only allowed to keep one of everything. So they were allowed to keep one toothbrush and one pair of trousers and so on and so forth. The only thing they were allowed to keep more than one of was hose for digging ditches, for irrigation and so on and so forth.
Hardly the kit for a military outfit.
Exactly.
It was after that, the Eastern Zone forces, they were ordered down to the Southwest Zone, and the Southwest Zone was ordered to shoot anybody from the Eastern Zone.
The Eastern Zone came under attack not only from the South people in the Southwestern Zone, but also at one point, I think it was 1977 or 78, they came up under attack from the Northeast Zone as well. And as the story progresses, it appears pretty obvious that Pol Pot's had a big falling out with the Eastern Zone, and particularly the commander, Sopum, who was on the Central Committee of the party. But, as you know, what was going on, everything was so compartmentalized at the time. People didn't really know what was going on everywhere. Anywhere. It was very centralized under the central command of Pol Pot.
Angkar.
And the Angkar didn't really
Also, in English, that's a reference to the organisation as they were obliquely and omnisciently referred to.
Yeah, what's new in this book, and a lot of people have asked me so we had the Khmer edition before, this is the English edition. There are a few other things maybe I'll mention later, but from in point of view of the text, what's interesting is there's additional text on the death of Sopam. You're probably aware a lot of foreign academics have speculated for a long time that Sopam committed suicide in 1978. In fact, Heng Samrin, who was very, very close to Sopam, recounts in quite detail how he was ordered to be killed along with his wife and children by Pol Pot's forces. And that took place in Pre Veng province. They were trying to escape to Vietnam but never got there.
Where I'm something of a fan of this book is because it does shed light on a period where simply not enough is known. There are very few good books around that documented what happened, that documented the Vietnamese occupation, one or two exceptions. But when compared, say, with the books that have focused on Pol Pot himself and the Khmer Rouge, there's very little is out there.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's two books. One was written by an American guy that covered the period in the 80s pretty
Evan
well.
Gottesman.
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. The other one that's much more extensive is by the Australian academic Margaret Slocum. The story behind that is quite funny because there was an Australian colleague who was working at the National Library, and one day, this must have been sometime in the 90s, late 90s perhaps, one day saw someone carrying out a whole lot of documents to throw in the rubbish or burn or whatever, and this person said, well, what's that? And he checked them out, and they were all these old party documents from the 1980s. So this Australian guy said, well, hold on, don't throw these out. And the story I've been told is that Margaret got copies of these documents, these internal party documents and speeches and stuff, and was, because she can read Khmer, she was able to reconstruct a lot of that period very, very well from internal party documents.
And of course, Heng Samrin played a large part in the political landscape of this country. Another 2 decades of war continued, an eventual peace of sorts. But how is his relationship across the region? I mean, the book has got some terrific photos there that I've certainly never seen, and he's tied up with all sorts of leaders from Fidel Castro to the communists of Belarus to obviously the region Laos and Vietnam. Where is his place in the communist system?
For the sake of listeners, I think we should just sort of go back a little bit and just sort of point out that
Sure.
December 2, 1978, Heng Samrin and 13 other people defecting set up the United Front for the National Salvation of Cambodia, as it was called then. The military offensive started about 3 weeks later, and by 4 or 5 weeks later, the 7th of January, Phnom Penh was liberated. From that time, huge amounts of Vietnamese and Soviet assistance in particular flowed in, and there was a lot of assistance coming in from other Eastern Bloc countries, Cuba. We can't forget India. India was the only non-socialist bloc country that recognized the People's Republic of Kampuchea that was established in 1979. And basically up until the early 90s, when you had the Paris Peace Accords, all the foreign assistance coming to the People's Republic of Kampuchea was from the Soviet Union, its Eastern Bloc allies in Europe, Mongolia for what it's worth, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam and India. That was it. And Heng Samrin travelled pretty widely during this period. I mean, you see from the book there's photos of him with Gorbachev, with, the Hungarian leader, the Czech leader, East German leaders, Fidel Castro and stuff. So he was fairly well known, but as you probably recall, he was sort of reviled in the West as some sort of puppet of Vietnam. And what's interesting now is, of course, in the early 90s, he emerged as the honorary chairman of the party. And we should step back a bit. I mean, in 1979, he went on to become president of the State Council of the People's Republic of Kampuchea. So, he was effectively head of state. A few years after that, he became Secretary General of the party. Okay, and it was only in the early 90s that he became honorary chairman of the party. I mean, since then, he's re-emerged as president of the National Assembly. So he's had this sort of second lease of life. He's now 84 years old and incredibly active. He still travels abroad. As you're aware, he's currently the chairman of the Asia-Pacific Parliamentary Forum. He's going to be chairing that next month in Samrin. But for an 84-year-old, he's surprisingly sprite and very, very active.
Still enjoying the odd game of golf, I'm told.
Apparently, he's a very, very keen golfer, and he does quite a lot of exercise every morning when he gets up.
Okay, still a village boy.
Yeah, from my understanding, he doesn't particularly love living in Phnom Penh. He'd rather be back in his village, and when he gets the opportunity, he goes back to the village. As you can see in the book, he's done a lot to build new housing and various infrastructure, such as irrigation facilities in his village. But he says he's most happy when he's back in the village.
Right. Cambodia has also gone through quite a few political upheavals over the last 12 months, particularly in the lead up to the election. And in a kind of quirky way, there is a separation of powers in this country between the party and the executive. Mm-hmm. And Heng Samrin has really stood aside from, I guess, the political maelstrom that impacted on Cambodia this year. It's almost like there's the role of the monarchy, the role of the party, which a lot of people tend to overlook in this country. And then there's the role of government. Mm-hmm. How would you define Heng Samrin's place within all of this? You go around the countryside and you'll see no shortage of billboards with the Prime Minister Hun Sen up there, and also up there used to be Chair Sim, who has chaired the party and has since passed away, and there's Heng Samrin.
You referred to various political events over the last 12 months or so. I mean, basically Heng Samrin has been above the fray. In Cambodia now, we've got a system similar to what they have in Vietnam and Laos. You've got these sort of four key pillars. In Cambodia, we've got the monarchy. We've also got the party, the government, and the National Assembly. Now, you've got the same things in Vietnam and Laos, except there's no monarchy in Laos or Vietnam anymore. Instead, you've got the state president of both countries. The other thing in Cambodia is that a lot of people in Anglo-Saxon countries with Westminster systems find this a bit difficult to understand, but in Cambodia we've got a very strong separation of government and parliament, and it's more modelled on the French system. And I was talking to someone from Holland the other day. They're saying it's very much the same system as well. When you have elections, you get elected to the National Assembly, but then some of those elected go off and form the government, Prime Minister, Interior Minister, Defence Minister, whatever. And then you have other people who come in to replace them. So at any given time, the National Assembly is off doing its business and the government's off doing its business. They're quite separate. And quite often the chairs of the various committees that you have at the National Assembly can summon ministers and say, well, what's this? You've drafted this law. This doesn't look like it's the correct wording and stuff like that. So it very much follows the French system and not the Westminster system.
How did you get involved with this project, bringing it back to the book, Cambodia Reborn?
In 2014, I was appointed as senior advisor to the Parliament, and around, I think it must have been the following year, 2015, I was asked if I could help edit the English language version of this book. Now, I was given the text and quickly found out that it was the translations that had been done by 4 or 5 different people. So the first major challenge was to get consistent spellings of people's names and geographical names. The geography sounds a bit irrelevant, but as you know, it's a complete nightmare in Cambodia because there's always different ways to spell, even provinces, and no one agrees on this. And
Kampong, Kampong.
Oh, it's just, one ministry will use one set of spellings in the Latin alphabet, another ministry will use another. We used fairly standard ones, which are pretty well known. But there was a lot of geographic detail, extraordinary amount of geographic detail in this book, of various battles that took place in the late 60s towards the late 70s as well, when they were overthrowing Pol Pot. The amount of geographic detail is quite extraordinary. That was the first challenge, to sort of get all the spellings consistent.
Right.
The second challenge is we had to go back with the translation team and check the translation. And of course we found a lot of errors. And that was a fairly time-consuming task, as people had their own jobs and were doing it, so we could sometimes meet for 2 or 3 hours a week, maybe 4 or 5 hours a week. Mm-hmm. But we weren't working on it full-time because we had other things to do. And that's why it took 2 or 3 years for us to finalise the whole thing and be confident that it was a accurate translation.
With the invasion, which I suppose was the defining moment of Heng Samrin's career, if it hadn't been for that, he could have easily have been slaughtered along with the rest of them. And the invasion, they had their fair points of resistance where they had to fight their way through, but it was that invasion that made Heng Samrin as a man and set him up as a politician of the future.
Well, I think no one else had ever heard of him before except the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese knew him from the early 60s.
Right.
And in fact, there's quite an interesting episode in the book where Heng Samrin and the people with him are trying to make contact with the Vietnamese, and they contact some Vietnamese, but they don't know who Heng Samrin is. And finally, he gets put in contact with his senior Vietnamese military commander, who's been trying to find him, but Pol Pot's forces had been sort of lying and saying, oh no, he's in the interior of the country, we don't know where he is, and stuff like that. We, of course, don't use the I word in the book. We use the word offensive because, that's sort of more of a military term. It was a joint Cambodian-Vietnamese military offensive. No one can argue with that, and that's just the plain facts of history. We avoided using the word advance because that's a bit of a euphemism that some people talk about. For example, in Southeast Asia, the Japanese advance into Southeast Asia. So we avoided that. We just we tried to stick to military terminology.
Well, there's a reluctance to use the word invade.
It's a loaded word. It's a loaded word.
Well, it was a foreign military coming into for whatever the reasons, and no matter how justified. I still find it incredulous that some people, particularly in Cambodia, like to argue that the Vietnamese invasion was not justified and that it was just a land grab, when it's obvious what the Vietnamese found here and the atrocities that were committed under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, particularly out at S21, were extraordinary, and there was more than enough justification there.
Well, there's two things there. The recent verdicts that were delivered by the Khmer Rouge
genocide trial
were genocide against the Cham Muslim population and the Vietnamese population. Now, a lot of that stuff happened, and in the court ruling, it's limited to the killing of Vietnamese inside Cambodia's territory.
Right.
That particular judgment doesn't extend to all the Vietnamese on Vietnamese territory.
Well, there were a lot of incursions conducted by Pol Pot.
Exactly.
And what he considered Saigon as they call Prey Nacor, and the banana leaf line, in that anything south of the banana leaf line, which is where bananas grow, was Kampuchea Krom, or territory defined by the Khmer Rouge as legitimately Cambodia. And it just seemed absolute folly to think that they could command military incursions into southern Vietnam and reclaim this land as their own. And really what they did was they weren't, the incursions were kind of cross the border, slaughter as many Vietnamese as you can, and then run back behind the border. It was military nonsense.
Absolutely. It's worth pointing out, and it'd be good if Cambodians, particularly younger Cambodians, were aware of this. The hundreds of people who were killed in these attacks, particularly in...
I'd say thousands.
Yeah, I think so. No one, of course, really knows, but it's more likely to be in the thousands.
So where they crossed the border at Tay Ninh and slaughtered the Cao Dai, who had their own set of
religious beliefs.
Yes, and they were always considered a bit of an anathema to Hanoi, and they didn't like them at all because the Cao Dai were very anti-communist. But they crossed the border, and I got told 5,000 was slaughtered in a day. Now, I don't know whether that's an exaggeration or not, but it's there were an awful lot of people that were killed, and they said the Mekong River ran red with blood that day, which is what they told me many years ago.
You know, the two major attacks occurred in Tai Ninh province in Vietnam and An Giang province in Vietnam. And you go over to Chau Doc today,
which is a border town on the river,
on the Basak River. You know, there's still monuments to the war dead, and you know, let's point out a lot of these people were women and children. They were. We're not talking about Pol Pot's forces fighting Vietnamese military forces. We're talking about
sneak attacks.
Sneak attacks, slaughtering women and children. And, you know, there was most of the people killed, from all the accounts I've read, were civilians.
Right, and there's no denying what happened here now, particularly given the tribunal has delivered its verdict on the genocide, it's delivered its verdict on crimes against humanity, and on what happened at the S-21 extermination camps. So these arguments that the Vietnamese were more or less helping themselves, and it was, I guess, an extension of the domino theory that was always prevalent at the time, and there is some argument to that. However, to overlook the atrocities that were being committed here, it's almost offensive in itself. Yeah,
I mean, one of the problems with the verdict is some Cambodians may be tempted to sort of say, well, what about us? You know, what about all the people, the other people who were exterminated by the Khmer Rouge? And that's, I mean, you know the reason for that. That was because the definition...
The tribunal was defined by crimes that only occurred in Cambodia and between April 75 and early January 1979.
Yeah, and you can't commit genocide against your own people.
This is a legal argument.
That's a legal argument that was used, but it's sometimes difficult to explain to some Cambodians.
What does Heng Samrin say about genocide? And did he fully comprehend what was happening here before he defected, or did this only become obvious after he returned with the invading forces?
Well, no. Definitely beforehand. I mean,
the extent of the carnage that was occurring.
You know, it's hard to put a timeline on it, but I mean, between 1975 and 1978, there was a pretty slow and gradual realisation that things were not going right. In 1976, they were preparing for the celebration of the anniversary of the founding of the party, making all these celebrations to have a big party the next day and slaughter some cattle or whatever and have a big party. I think it was around midnight on the day before, they received a telex from Phnom Penh saying, look, no, it's all over, it's all been cancelled. So if you read very carefully, it's quite clear that Heng Samrin suspected something weird was going on in Phnom Penh as early as 1976. And when you read through 76, 77, 78, there's a gradual realisation that Pol Pot had actually, you know, was
obliterated his own country.
Yeah, and he was intent. He had a particular gripe against the Eastern Zone. He thought they were too much influenced by the Vietnamese. Pol Pot, you know, attempted to execute So Phum when he came.
The head of the
Eastern Zone.
Yeah.
When he came on a sort of reconnaissance mission to Phnom Penh. Anyway, he escaped with Heng Samrin's forces, and that's when they were trying to get So Phum to Vietnam, and that's when he was killed by Pol Pot's forces. But then Heng Samrin's people were separated. He went back to his home village and blah, blah, blah. And eventually they got over the border into Vietnam. And when the Vietnamese found him, they were saying, oh, this is the guy we've been looking for. This is the guy we've known since the early 60s. And
right.
They, you know, flew him by aircraft to Ho Chi Minh City. They put him in a hotel. I think he'd never been in a hotel before. He'd certainly never been in an aircraft before. And, you know, as they say, the rest is history.
And on that note, Peter Starr, congratulations on what I understand has been an immense amount of work in delivering Cambodia Reborn into English and doing all the academics, historians and journalists who have covered this country a very big favour. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luke.